Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon to share some of the work that we've been doing at London Councils to collate and combine electric vehicle charge point usage data for London. On the next slide, I've just given just a few quick points of what I'll cover in my presentation today. So I'll start with some background information on sort of the charge point landscape in London. I'll then give an overview of the dashboard that's been created. I'll talk you through some of the usage and trends from 2020, and then just give an overview of next steps for the project. So if we go on to the next slide, just in terms of background, so London is really leading the UK in terms of charge point delivery. The last data set we received from ZapMap on the total number of public charge points in London confirmed that we have nearly 6,500 public charge points in total. So that makes up nearly 20% of all public charge points in the UK. And the majority of that delivery has been on Borough Highway, which makes up, as I'm sure many of you are aware, makes up 95% of the road network in London. Unfortunately, despite the number of charge points that have been delivered across the UK, there's currently no sort of mandated data sharing requirement for charge point operators. Some of you may be familiar with ZapMap, I mentioned them earlier. ZapMap are an online platform that share charge point location data. So it's primarily data for users who are looking for a public charge point, and it's currently the most comprehensive data source available, although this data is shared directly between the operators and ZapMap themselves. So it's not openly available data for local authorities or anybody else who's looking at planning charge point delivery. So this is something that is a nationwide challenge, really, and something that the Office for Zero Emissions Vehicles are currently looking into. They actually have a consultation out at the moment on charge point user experience, and that includes some questions about data sharing. But until there are changes at a national level, data sharing requirements have been very much down to individual agreements between local authorities or landowners and the charge point operators themselves. So in London, where we have 32 boroughs and the City of London, so we have 33 local authorities in total, this has historically meant that data has been collected and shared in very different ways. And actually, until last year, we had no overall picture, despite having quite a significant number of charge points at that point. We had no overall picture of how those charge points were actually being used or utilised across the capital. So that was something that we really wanted to, it was a challenge for London and something that we wanted to address. So Spencer mentioned in the introduction that back in 2017, London, as part of a joint bid from London Councils, the GLA and Transport for London, we secured just over £13 million in funding for the GOLCS programme. And that funding was provided to support borough delivery of on-street residential charge points. So to support boroughs in procuring those charge points, we worked really closely with TfL and created a brand new procurement framework for London boroughs to use to procure charge point suppliers. And that gave us an opportunity really at that point to implement some pan-London data standards as part of the framework requirements. These were agreed at the time with London boroughs and also with charge point operators as part of the framework development process. We've been really lucky that that framework has been really well used. It's been very popular with London boroughs, and so we have been receiving quite comprehensive charge point usage data since October 2019. And last year we partnered with the London Office of Technology and Innovation, who are Lottie, and the GLA to work together to collate that data in one place and analyse it in a way that would be accessible to all London boroughs, to help them to understand how charge points are being used and also to inform future delivery. So that's kind of the background to what's led to the development of the online dashboard that we've now created. We only launched the dashboard in November of last year, so it's quite a new tool, but I'll talk you through sort of what it does and what it shows. So in the next slide, there's just some information on the dashboard overall. So the last set of data we received on the dashboard was for the end of 2020, and that included data for just under 3,500 charge points in total. So it's obviously not all of the charge points in London, but it's just over half of all the public charge points. So it provides a really useful insight into how those are being used. It also provides data for charge points in 30 of the 33 London boroughs. So it's useful for the majority of boroughs. So the data is provided from the operators who are on the procurement framework, and those operators are listed down the side of that slide. Not all of those providers have actually delivered through the framework, but the ones that have been sharing the data with us. And the majority of the charge points that have been delivered are slow to fast charge points. They've been delivered in residential areas. If you live in London, you may have noticed charge points that have been installed in or on your lamppost columns in your residential areas. So lots of those charge points are the type of charge points that have been included in this data set. We have in Q4, in the last set of data we received in 2020, received data for just over 160 rapid charge points. So that's about a third of all the rapid charge points in London, which is really useful because now we can do some comparison between the different types of charge points and how they're being used. The data is provided quarterly, and that was the requirement as part of the framework. And it's been provided since October 2019. So we have 15 months of data in total. The last set brought us to the end of 2020. Unfortunately, at the moment, the data is provided manually, so it's not done via an automatic feed. And so it's a manual process of uploading that to the GLA data store, where it then feeds into the dashboard and presents its analysis. The data we receive is limited sort of charging event and usage data. It includes things like the time and date that users plug in and plug out of the charge point, the time and date the actual charge starts and finishes, and the total energy that is drawn from the charging event. We don't have access to additional data to include things like anonymous data on the user, so we can't unfortunately do any analysis on behaviours of specific user groups. So for example, taxi drivers or different vehicle types. So for example, plug-in hybrids versus full electric vehicles. At the moment, the dashboard is available online to London councils, TfL, GLA and the London boroughs only. If we go to the next slide, you'll just be able to see there what the dashboard looks like when users log into it. So as you can see, it's quite a busy page. There's quite a lot of graphs, and there's also an interactive map there in the middle. All of the graphs that you can see there, they all scroll to show additional graphs and additional analysis. And there's actually 25 different graphs in total, which show analysis of different trends. There's also some filters that can be applied for a user. So across the top and down the side, there are filters related to things like time period, charge point operator, charge point type, and then down the side you will see the list of all of the London boroughs. So that allows the user to really personalise the analysis to their own requirement. So for example, a specific London borough could see what's happening specifically in their area, or they could select boroughs in their region, or they could look at what's happening on a pan-London level as well. So the next slide shows what that map looks like when we zoom into it. So it's a heat map of utilisation. When the user zooms into the map, they can see each of the charge points that have been delivered are identified on the map, and each of them are given a colour to display their utilisation. So that means that users can really see, for example, where they have pockets of high utilisation or low utilisation. And that's particularly useful when informing future delivery and understanding the utilisation of existing infrastructure against growing demand. When the user clicks on the charge point on the map, they're also shown the summary information you can see on the left there, and that shows details of the specific charge point. So it's things like the address, the operator, the power outage, and a monthly breakdown of utilisation as well. If we move on to the next slide, so this is just really for information and reference if anyone wanted to look back at this, but this slide just lists the 25 graphs that I mentioned that are included on the dashboard. So they're broken down in sort of four key sections. So we have a section on dashboard summary. So that sort of summarises what the numbers of the numbers of charge points that are included in the dashboard and that sort of thing. And then we have charge point activity summary, and then specific sections for the different types of charge points. So one for slow to fast charge points and one for rapid charge points. If we move to the next slide. So just to give you a flavour really for what we understand about charge point usage from the dashboard, and this is an understanding that we didn't have previously. I'll give a short overview of the pan-London trends we've seen in 2020, and then I'll talk you through some of the trends for slow to fast and then for rapid charge points. Just so you know, we all know that 2020 has been a very unusual year for travel patterns. So the data that we've seen from last year isn't necessarily what we would expect to see replicated in future years. But I think that the data still provides some really useful insight and shows really very positive trends, both in terms of the delivery of charge point infrastructure and demand and usage. So across London, we see that the data is showing a growth in the number of charge points and also growth in the average charge point usage. So in January of 2020, the dashboard was receiving data for less than 2,000 charge points, and in December it was for nearly 3,500, as I mentioned, and we expect that to rise quite significantly again this year. And when we look at the number of charging events recorded, so the graph at the bottom left shows, it's quite a busy graph, but it shows the number of charging events each month broken down by each borough. So you can see there that there was a decline in number of charging events during the first lockdown in spring of nearly a year ago, spring 2020, and then a significant rise every month after that. And just to give a sense of scale, the average number of charging events per charge point has increased by more than 300% between January and December. For total kilowatts charged, so the graph on the bottom right there, that's what that shows. So as would be expected with the upward trend in charging events, the increase of the energy used is also significant. So whilst the number of charge points less than doubled in that 12-month period, the total amount of energy drawn increased tenfold. Okay, and on to the next slide. So this is just a short summary of what we're seeing for slow to fast charge points in particular. And the analysis really shows that these type of charge points are being used exactly in the way that we would expect them to be used. The data gives us lots of information about utilization rates, and we're able to look at utilization both by the amount of time that users are actually plugged into a charge point and then the amount of time that they're charging. And we see that users are plugged in for nearly double the amount of time that they need to charge. That's to be expected because these are generally charge points that people use overnight while their car is parked. They generally don't need 12 hours of charge. So the majority of charges for this type of charge point take less than 5 hours in total. And then we were also able to see things like when are the most popular days of the week for plugging in and when are the most popular times for plugging in. And the time section is particularly important as we have more charge points that are delivered in London. And we see that plug-in times are actually the peak time for electricity usage. So it's between 4 PM and 7 PM. And so that really presents lots of opportunity for smart charging in the future. And the next slide, please, is on rapid charge points. So for rapid charge points, we're also seeing, so we only have data, as I mentioned, for the rapid charge points for Q4 of 2020. So we have 3 months worth of data. So this is quite new for us to understand how rapid charge points are being used across London. And what we've seen, which was quite surprising, is that the average utilisation of these charge points is actually very similar to the utilisation of the slow fast charge points. But when we look at a regional breakdown, the utilisation is slightly higher in central London than it is in inner and outer London. And in 2020, Thursday was the most popular day for rapid charge points to be used. And the time of plug-in was fairly consistent between 8 AM and 8 PM. As we would expect, all charges are less than 50 minutes in duration, so users tend to plug in and charge and then leave that charge point once they have received the charge that they require. And then the final slide is just on next steps. So as I mentioned, this dashboard is really quite a new tool. We launched it in November, but feedback we've received from the boroughs using it so far has been really positive. And they are using it to understand how the network of different operators is working across their borough and using it to inform future planning and delivery. We are constantly making improvements, and currently one of our priorities based on borough feedback is to add additional layers to the dashboard that could be used to identify future demand. We're also working with operators to improve the process for the data sharing. So currently, as I mentioned, this is a manual process and we would like it to be more automatic in the future. And then finally, we're working with Lottie and the GLA to draft a sort of standard procurement clause for boroughs to use in future contracts. The procurement framework we use at the moment will be coming to an end next year, and we want to make sure that data across London continues to be shared in a consistent and centralised way through to the dashboard. And we would like to collect some additional data, including things like when the charge point isn't operational, the number of unique users per month, and a few additional fields that boroughs have said would be useful. Our experience has shown that operators are not particularly willing to share that data unless they're contractually required to do so. So that's why we really want to make sure that there is a standard clause that all boroughs can adopt. That's everything from me. Thank you very much. I hope that was a useful summary. And yes, I'll be on the panel at the end to take any questions.